No other New Testament book is quite like James. Catchy, practical, and in your face. The book of James jumps straight into the nitty-gritty of daily life. James doesn't just want us hearing what God says. He wants us doing what God says. You can't read James without being confronted. He steps on your toes. At times, he punches you in the gut. And through it all, James wants us to see what God is doing and then join him in it.
Good morning, Summit Church at our campuses around the Triangle. I do hope that you will get one of these that your campus team just talked to you about and put it on your wrist or hang it around the gear shift of your car or tape it to the front of your head or whatever it takes for you to remember the name of this young man or young lady, and you can pray for them throughout the week while they are at our student camp up in Tennessee. Charles Spurgeon, who was the greatest preacher of the 19th century, was once asked by somebody after a service or in between services to identify the secret of the power that he had in his preaching. And so he took this person who'd asked him that question down to the bottom floor of their church into what they called the boiler room, because it literally was where the heaters were, the boilers. When he opened that door, he showed that person that asked the question why he had so much power in his preaching. There were hundreds of people in this room that were on their knees, on their faces, praying throughout the entirety of the service. While he preached, they prayed, and the result was the incredible power on his preaching. We actually have here at the Summit Church at all of our campuses and all of our services what we call boiler room ministries that pray throughout the services for God's power on me or whoever up here is standing up here preaching. You might want to check that ministry out. It's a great thing to do on the weekend as a part of ministry here, but I share that now because these bracelets are a way that we can do this all week long for the students and the volunteers as they go out to camp. By the way, I just got this report a little bit ago. Did you know, listen, we have over 1,100 students and volunteers that are headed out to student camp this week. Isn't that amazing? 1,100, that is students, a few very tired and overworked staff, and then a bunch of volunteers who have taken a few days off of work so they can go up and be a part of this ministry team. In fact, if you were one of those 1,100, whether you're a volunteer, staff, or student at any of our campuses, would you stand up right now at one of our campuses? Go ahead, stand up. This is who we're praying for. Listen. For you students, you are going to have the time of your lives. For you adult volunteers, go with God, my friends, go with God. You guys can sit down. A week with middle or high schoolers. Hey, listen, I'm standing up here with you. I would not miss this for the world. I will be there a couple of days this week for both middle and high school camp, and I wouldn't want to miss it. So anyway, you make sure that you pray. James chapter 1, if you got your Bibles this morning, I hope that you brought them. James chapter 1. Last week, we saw that trials are a defining moment in the life of a believer. Trials, James said, reveal what you really believe about God and how much you trust him. Trials show what your faith is really made of. You can talk a big spiritual game all day long, but trials are going to show you where your faith really lies. These defining moments, they're never fun, but they do play a very important role in your life, because a defining moment is when something becomes real to you. It's when it goes from being a concept that you nod your head to being a reality that you experience. I have a friend whose middle school son was having some behavioral issues. And so this dad, like many of us who have middle schoolers, we tried everything he knew to get his son's attention and to bring his behavior in line, but none of his lectures, none of his punishments ever seemed to work. If you're a parent of a middle school student, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You just like, it was an amazing lesson. It was eloquently stated, and it had no effect. Well, this guy is also a pilot, and so he decided that he would take his son up on an airplane ride and use that different perspective on the world from 10,000 feet to talk to his son about the need to grow up and the need to make better decisions. This dad discovered that these high altitude conversations put his son in a totally different frame of mind. And after they returned from one of these trips, his son was always much more cooperative and respectful. So whenever his son's behavior began to deteriorate again, he would just take him up in the plane, look him in the eye, and tell him what was expected of him as a young man. Well, having a middle school son of my own, I was so intrigued by this, I asked him if I could accompany him on one of these airplane rides just to see what he said and how they worked. I snapped this picture, which might explain why the technique was so successful. So just kidding, that is not a real picture. But a trial is a defining moment where God looks you in the eye and he says to you, do you actually trust me? Do you actually really trust? I'm not talking about, do you know the words and the verses and the praise songs? I mean, do you actually trust me? What are you really leaning the weight of your life on? James continues his counsel about persevering through trials in verse 9 by giving us more perspective that he wants us to have, and then he gives to us a very important warning. Listen, before we just dive in there, trials and suffering are the hardest part of the Christian life. Nobody enjoys it. They often leave you wondering if you did something wrong or why God doesn't seem to care. You're like, God, what about me? I just want a good marriage. I just want to have kids. God, you've given me this desire for mothering. Why can't I have kids? Or I just want to feel good. I just want to be healthy and strong. There are so many things I want to do in life. I want to do them for other people. God, I can't do that feeling the way that I feel. I'm always so tired, or I'm in such pain, or I just want to have a little financial stability. I want to have a little financial freedom, or maybe it's like, you're like, I just want my mom to be well, or I just want my parents to be together and not get divorced. God, what about me? Listen, James was no stranger to suffering, and nor was the audience to whom he was writing. These people have been unjustly driven away from their homeland, but James wants them and you and me to know that God is up to something good in these trials. Today, what he's gonna give you, again, he's gonna give you a new perspective. Number one, he's gonna show you that trials reveal our false foundations. That's the first 4 verses, verses 9 through 12. And then he's going to give to us in the next 6 verses a dire warning. And that dire warning is beware the deadly off-ramp of sin. Let's talk about those one at a time. Number one, trials reveal false foundations. Verse 9, James says, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower falls, its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. One of the things that trials do is reveal where your life is built on faulty foundations. For many people, the thing that they build their whole lives on is money. Getting it, saving it, keeping it, and that will not endure. So James tells the rich, he says, rejoice in your humiliation, the humiliation that trial brings. And by the way, by humiliation, he just means that when things happen to you that your money cannot protect you from. Rejoice in those things, he tells them, because that's helping you see that money is not a foundation that you want to build your life on. During the COVID pandemic, I told you the story of a lumberjack who was preparing to cut down several trees in a mountain forest. And just before he began, he noticed a beautiful bird that was building its nest atop one of the trees. Well, not wanting to harm the bird or its young, the lumberjack took out a mallet. Before he got out his saw or his axe, he took out a mallet and began to pound on the base of the tree where that bird was building its nest until the bird, who was quite annoyed, by the way, flew to another tree and began to build its nest there. Well, the lumberjack was also planning to cut down that tree, so he repeated the process on that second tree. And so the bird moved to a third tree, which the lumberjack was also planning to cut down, and so he did it again. The bird and the lumberjack repeated this dance a half dozen or so times until the bird abandoned all the trees in the forest and built its nest on the side of the rock face. Now, I imagine that bird never quite understood why the lumberjack was attacking every tree that it attempted to build its nest in. But the lumberjack's motive, of course, was not meanness. His motive was compassion. The lumberjack knew that every tree in the forest was about to come down, and he wanted the bird to build its nest in a place that his axes could not touch. See, that's what God does with us in a trial. He reveals those false places that we've put our confidence. For most people, they base their whole lives on the premise that money is security. Money is significance. Money is beauty. Money is enjoyment. Money is freedom. And if you got money, you can obtain all the good things you want in life and protect yourselves from all the bad ones that you don't want. And if you don't have money, well, then basically you're powerless. You know, it's helpful to consider that in James's day, the line between the haves and the have-nots was really, really stark. The wealthy tended to be crazy wealthy. They owned all the land and they had seemingly infinite resources, and the poor, all they could do was work the land that the rich owned. They were basically like sharecroppers. That meant the poor had almost no possibility of upward mobility. There was no middle class that we think about today. If you were poor, most likely you would be poor forever, and so would your children. The result was that you had two very distinct classes in first century, the Roman Empire, where the rich felt invulnerable and the poor felt helpless. But trials come, James says. Trials come and they reveal that the rich are not really invulnerable. I mean, y'all, there is nothing like a disease diagnosis or divorce papers or a dissolving relationship that will show you how powerless your money actually is. Right? Pastor Brian tells the story of several years ago, being on an airplane, when one of the engines went out. Now, I can tell you guys that in all the flights I've ever been on, that has never happened to me, and I'm very thankful for that. He said it is one of the most terrifying experiences of his life. He said, we heard this loud bang, a boom, and then we saw smoke coming out of the engine on the right wing about 8,000 feet in the air, followed by an eerie silence. He said, that is the last thing you want to hear in a plane, a loud boom and then an eerie silence. Brian said, but then all of a sudden something beautiful began to happen. All of us spontaneously stretched out across the aisles and held each other's hands and started praying together. Blacks prayed with whites. Asians prayed with Hispanics. There was no first class or economy comfort. If you were in the front of the plane, he said, and when it went down, it just means you were going to be the first to die. He said, in that moment, we were all classless. A bunch of people in the exact same predicament. Nobody cared who was sitting where, or what kind of watch that was on your wrist. We were all uniquely aware of our own mortality. And in those moments, class did not matter. See, that's what a trial does, James says. It reveals weakness. In a trial, he says, all your riches are useless to stop disease or death or divorce. All flesh, rich or poor, it's just grass. A couple of hot weeks with no rain, and the rich will fade away as easily as the poor does. It doesn't matter if you're a hydrangea or a dandelion. The sun comes out, and if you don't get any water, you're all gonna end up the same way anyway. Now, truth be told, not only is money unable to save you on the day of death, money really won't satisfy you now. And trials show you that. I mean, maybe this morning you're financially comfortable. You got every kind of insurance, every kind of convenience money can buy, but now you're going through a divorce. And you're seeing that all that money was unable to build for you a stable home. You weren't able to buy any insurance that would guarantee a happy family. Or maybe you got a kid who is wandering that you're really, really worried about. And all your money, all the things you can pay for cannot get a hold of that kid's heart. Or you just got a bad report from the doctor and all your money cannot remove the tumors. Or maybe after all it is that you've obtained, you still feel unsatisfied and empty. I heard Tony Evans say this recently. Money can buy a bed, but not sleep. It can buy books, but not brains. It can buy food, but not appetite. It can buy finery, but not beauty. It can buy a house, but not a home, medicine, but not health, luxuries, but not culture, amusements, but not happiness. It can buy religion, but not salvation. Money can get you a passport to everywhere except for heaven. So again, James tells the rich, rejoice in your humiliation because it's keeping you from building your lives on false foundations. And rich people usually never realize that before it's too late. Now, before I discuss the flip side of this, what James says to the poor, I want you to make sure you don't just think about this in terms of being financially rich. Anything you're rich in, you're likely to start trusting in. Some of you, for example, you don't have a lot of money, but you're rich in popularity. Maybe you're in high school, maybe you're in college, and you're just always popular. The result is that your identity is built on people liking you. If so, you should rejoice when other people don't speak well of you, when you're not roundly praised, when you don't get invited to the party, when you're the one that gets cropped out in the picture on Instagram, because only then will you see whether or not you've built your foundation on what God thinks about you instead of what everybody else thinks about you. If I'm used to being roundly praised for my gifts, it's only when that praise is not there that I can consider, okay, how weighty is God's approval actually to me? For example, I love it. I love it when people write me encouraging notes and say that God has used me in their lives, that they enjoy my preaching or whatever. I love that. But I'm telling you, when I look back, it has been those seasons where those notes were not coming, or when I was really being criticized. It was in those seasons that I had to consider whose opinion really mattered to me. Was it yours or was it God's? Is my identity built on his approval or is it built on your approval? By the way, I'm not asking you to write me critical notes to help me grow in my sanctification, just to be clear, okay? I'm only saying that when trial and humiliation comes, then and only then am I forced to consider what the real foundations of my life are. For those of you who are rich in anything, trials reveal false foundations. Now, the flip side of James's counsel, to the poor, verse 9, who basically live in a state of trial, James says, boast in your exaltation, which means reflect on the fact that in Christ you have riches beyond anything money could buy for anybody. Reflect on the fact that you have a heavenly Father, for example, who loves you and sings over you with rejoicing and has promised never to leave or forsake you, who has promised to bless you and make you a blessing to others, to work every single thing in your life for good, and soon to take you home to an inheritance of incalculable riches. That's real power, James says. That's real security. That's real riches. That's stuff the rich people around you, they don't have. So rejoice in your exaltation in the midst of a trial. It's like that 1980s movie, Coming to America. That's like The Chosen of the 1980s, okay, that movie? In which, not really, but in Eddie Murphy in that movie plays a prince from a faraway land, if I remember this correctly, called Zamunda. He's a prince from Zamunda who comes to America and through a series of unfortunate circumstances has to live like a poor man. Even taking a job as a lowly custodian at a McDonald's knockoff called McDowell's. Can't even get a job at the real McDonald's. He gets a job at McDowell's. Well, there he falls in love with a girl who's got this rich boyfriend who was always condescending to him and always looking down on Eddie and treating him disrespectfully because Eddie is so poor. Yet Eddie is never bothered by this treatment. He's always whistling at work, always in a good mood, and it seems like the oddest thing to every other character in the movie. But we, the viewers, we know why Eddie is so happy. Eddie knows that he's not really from there. In Eddie's real home, right, he's a child of the king, an incredibly wealthy king, and soon and very soon, he's gonna see that king who's got an inheritance of incalculable value waiting for him. James says to the poor, rejoice because you are a child of the king. And soon and very soon, you're gonna see that king. And in the meantime, you can rest assured that sovereign king is working in all your trials to produce something in you far more valuable than silver or gold, and that is the beauty of Christ's likeness. You might be poor in dollars, he tells them, but you are rich in Jesus, and that's a reason to be happy. In trials, let the lowly brother rejoice in his exaltation, and let the rich brother in his humiliation. And then verse 12, James repeats his theme. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, whether that man is rich or poor. Both of you should remain steadfast under trial, because when you have stood the test, you will receive the crown of life, which is far more valuable than anything earthly riches can give to you, that God has promised to all those who love him. Rejoice and remain steadfast. By the way, a lot of Bible interpreters are going to wrongly divide up these verses in James like they're a bunch of little mini sermons. That is a mistake. That is a mistake. These are not a collection of mini sermons in James 1. These are all united by this theme of suffering, which is going to be true of the next little set of verses too, in verses 13 through 18. It's almost going to be like James launches out on another mini sermon, but it's going to be on this theme of how to go through suffering. That's what unites these two parts of this passage. So look there, James warns us in verse 13. He says, in a trial, number 2, after you change your perspective, you need to beware the deadly off-ramp of sin. Let me first just read to you these 6 verses. All right, here we go. Verse 13, let nobody say when he is tempted, I'm tempted by God. Because God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good and every perfect gift comes down from above, from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will, you see, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Now, first, note that James gives you a clarification there. He says, any temptation to sin in the trial is not from God. You see, in almost every trial, there will be a chance for a shortcut, a compromise, a sinful stress reliever, a plan B, some replacement for God. That temptation in the trial is not from God. Now, the reason James takes time to clarify this is because in Greek, the word for trial and temptation are the same word. In English, we use two different words. Trial typically means a difficulty, whereas temptation means an opportunity to sin. In Greek, however, they use one word for both trial and temptation. You know, preachers always be like, oh, if you could just read it in the Greek, it would be so much clearer. Well, actually here, it's actually better in English. And so, be thankful for that. The temptation to sin in a trial is never from God, he says, because God only ever gives good gifts. And that's because God, he says, verse 17, is like the sun. The sun always shines. You can hide yourself from the sun, or you can get far away from the sun, but the sun is always the same. And anytime you're in the presence of the sun, it is only warmth and light that radiate off of it. That's what God is like, he said. God does good all the time because he is good all the time. Bad cannot come from God because God is infinite and unceasing and consistent goodness. God is not like a shadow, James says, whose goodness lengthens or shortens depending on what time of day it is. God is not moody or capricious. You know, sometimes you look at him and he's leading you with tender love for your best interest, but then other times, he's irritated with you, so he's gonna mess with you a little bit, or he's gonna ignore you and lead you toward destruction or frustration. No, God only ever has one thing in his heart for you, one consistent, unfailing theme, and that is forever goodness. And just as a way of proving that, James throws in one little line at the end of that verse. He says, after all, think about this. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Even when you, in other words, deserved anger and wrath, God gave you new life. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth. He's the one that decided to save you in the first place. Your salvation was not your idea. Do you understand this? Your salvation was his idea. I say that because sometimes we present coming to Jesus like it was sort of a joint project. Oh, I wanted to be near God. I felt like something was missing in my life. I knew I needed to be a better person, and I knew I needed to get things straight, so I came back to God, and thankfully God received me. I realize it seems that way to you, but according to scripture, even those feelings you had of wanting to get close to God, those feelings were from God. Real quick, here are your key verses in addition to this verse in James. John 6:44, nobody can come to me, Jesus said, unless the Father who sent me draws him. You know what that means? If you came to Jesus, it's because the Father drew you. Philippians 2:13, how about this one? It is God who works in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. God not only gives you the power to do his will, he gives you the desire to do his will. He's in the willing and he's in the doing. John 1:12-13, how about this one? But to as many as received him, Jesus, to them he gave the right to become the children of God, to those who believed on his name. You're like, all right, well, in that one, it sounds like I'm the one doing it. I'm the receiver, I'm doing the receiving, I'm doing the believing. But look at what John says next in verse 13. If you received Jesus, you were born, watch this, not of blood, not of the will of the flesh, not of the will of man, you were born of God. In other words, whose will made all this happen? Was it your will? No, it was God's will. I've heard salvation presented like we were drowning in our sin. We were calling out for help. And Jesus came along in a lifeboat, and he's like, hey, do you want some help? And we're like, yes, please. I'm tired of being in this ocean of sin, and I really want to be up in the boat with you. And Jesus throws us a line. Thank you, Jesus, take the wheel. That's kind of how salvation is. A beautiful image. But truthfully, though, according to Jesus, according to James, when Jesus came to us, you and I were already face down in the water. We weren't struggling with sin. We were just face down, no longer breathing, without a pulse. And God pulled us into the boat, and he breathed new life into us of his own will. He brought us forth. Now, what James is using that to say is, I want you to think about this. If when you deserved wrath, if this is what God did for you and to you when you were his enemy, when you were spiritually dead, then only good ever comes from God. Thus, any temptation to sin, that doesn't come from him. Anytime you look into him, it's always gonna be goodness and truth and help and love. That's the only thing that ever comes from him. Because even when you deserve wrath, all he gave you was goodness, and God would not have brought you back to life when you were spiritually dead if he intended to lead you to destruction later. It's only ever good. So then you ask, well, then where does sin come from? In verse 14, James is gonna give you the anatomy of a sin. Verse 14, check it out. Each person, he says, but each person is tempted when he is lured away and enticed by his own desires. Look at that. Sin always starts with you. Not the devil, not your ex-husband, not your kids, not your boss. You sin when you are lured away by your own desire. A lot of people in a trial want to blame their sin on the trial. Well, the way I got treated in my divorce made me a really mean and vengeful person. I wouldn't have stolen or cheated unless I'd been wrong this way. James says, you may have indeed been wronged, but all the situation did was provide an opportunity for the bad parts of you to come out. That divorce, that quarrel with that friend, that overbearing boss, those things did not make you the way that you are. Those situations just gave an opportunity for those parts of you to come out. Listen, we saw this when we studied the life of David. You are never really gonna be able to deal with your sin. You'll never be able to really confess it, never really deal with it until you acknowledge that the primary source is you. And that's hard. Because since the beginning of the human race, we've been trying to blame other people for our sin. What did Adam say when God confronted him? That woman that you gave me. In half of a sentence, he blamed two different people. The woman that you gave me, she made me do it. I'm the only one who's innocent here. God, you're to blame and she's to blame. Even now when something happens, y'all, and we get caught in a sin, we wanna distance ourselves from that sin and we wanna say it's not the real us. How about this? You ever had one of those moments where something slips out of your mouth that totally embarrasses you? An outburst of anger? Or you said something snippy and unfair about somebody? Or you made a demeaning joke? Maybe you verbalized a lust and later you feel bad about what you said? And so you go back to the person you're kind of embarrassed and you want to apologize to them for saying that to them. And what do you usually say in that apology? What do you say? I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. That's not really me. Yeah, but in the moment you meant it, it came out so naturally. In fact, you've never met anything more in your life. And if that's not the real you, then where exactly did it come from? Maybe a better explanation is that as we grow up and get older, we get better at filtering what we say. So it doesn't embarrass us until we get really old and then we just take the filter off again and say whatever's in our heart, right? But for a while as we grow up, we get better at filtering it so that what's inside our heart doesn't come out and embarrass us. But y'all, just because we don't verbalize something doesn't mean it isn't in there. The real unfiltered us is a swirl of toxic desires. The other way I've told you to think about this is to consider this. What if there was a little monitor on the side of your head that displayed for everybody what you were thinking at any given moment? How many of you would have any friends left at the end of the day? Anybody? Sin, James says, comes from wayward and distorted desires in you. And until you embrace that, you will never really confess your sin or do the radical soul work that's necessary to get it out. Then desire, he says, when it's conceived, gives birth to sin. Desire grows into you until it finds an opportunity for expression, a way that you can express it and get away with it. And then sin, when it's fully grown and it's turned into a habit or a lifestyle or an addiction, that brings forth death. Let me just map that out for you really quickly, okay? What James is saying is that sin starts small as a desire deep in our hearts. But as it grows, as that desire grows, it gets stronger and stronger. Desires become ingrained ways of thinking. Ingrained ways of thinking start to become habits. Habits become addictions. Addictions become life trajectories, and that leads to spiritual death. Y'all, there's so much I want to say here. But let me just limit myself to a handful of observations. Number one, sin is the satanic off-ramp offered to us in any trial. This is the opposite of remaining steadfast. You lose your confidence in God and you turn to something else to give you comfort and peace that you should be getting from God. It's like the children of Israel in Exodus 32 when Moses got delayed up on the mountain with God. They concluded that God had forgotten about them. So what'd they do? They made a golden calf to replace God, and then they had a giant orgy in front of it. And I realize that's really graphic, but it demonstrates what happens when you take the off-ramp in a trial. Satan almost always will offer you, listen to this, a fleshly comfort as a substitute for trust. Here is a sensual pleasure. Here is a creature comfort. Here is a compromise. Here's a way to maintain control. Here's alcohol. Here's sex. Here's materialism. Here's the attention of somebody who's not your spouse. Here is shopping. Here's manipulation. The bottom line is that God is not enough for you, and you can't wait in faith for him. You need something right now, and because your soul is not feasting at the table of his presence, it's starving. And a starving soul will always look for something else to eat, and the thing that it looks for are the pleasures of sin, because that's what your enemy puts right in front of you. Y'all listen, this is important. Every sin that you commit this way, horizontally, alcoholism, drugs, sensuality, materialism, whatever, all of it begins with unbelief this way. It's like Martin Luther always said, every sin begins with an evil heart of unbelief. Before you express sin this way, anger, rage, stealing, adultery, whatever, watch, you're gonna express doubt and unbelief this way. Every vertical sin is the reflection, every horizontal sin is the reflection of a vertical disruption. Number two, sin leads to death. The indulging of those desires, the worship of that golden calf, y'all, it feels so right. It feels so necessary. It feels so gratifying in the moment, but it leads to destruction. Your enemy is using your wayward desires to lead you to destruction. Some of you have heard me tell this before, and it's a little graphic and even disturbing, but it gets the point across. It's the way they kill a wolf in Alaska. The wolves are a nuisance. They eat household pets. They will destroy livestock if you have them. And so what a farmer up in Alaska does is they take a very sharp two-edged knife and they would dip it in seal's blood, because wolves love seal's blood. And they let it freeze, and they do it again and again and again until you basically got a blood popsicle stick. And then they bury that knife up to the handle so that the blade is sticking out of the snow. And the wolf comes along and gets a scent of that seal's blood and goes over and begins to lick that blood popsicle stick. Of course, it numbs its tongue, and by the time it licks away the blood and gets down to the blade, it no longer has any feeling in its tongue, and it just lacerates its tongue into ribbons. The wolf no longer doesn't realize that the blood now pooling at its feet is no longer the blood of that seal. It's its own blood. And having killed itself, essentially, it wanders off and it dies. It bleeds to death. You understand, that's what sin does to you. It lures you away by your desires and numbs you to the destruction of your soul. Let me illustrate this from my own life. I'll go back several years. In my late 20s, I served as a missionary in Southeast Asia. And a long story I will not go into, some friends of mine that lived about 10 minutes north of me got caught kind of passing out Bibles, and so they were put in prison. Their cars were burned to the ground. And this mob of about 2,500 people were rioting, demanding that the police release them so they could kill them. One of the guys on their team was a national, and so he was able to blend back into the crowd. People didn't recognize him. He actually recorded this crowd that was screaming and crying out for the death of my friends. He played it for me later, and y'all, I'm not super superstitious, but I'm telling you, listening to that recording was demonic. And there was something about the anger and the rage, and I'm like, that is our enemy, and he was calling out for the death of my friends. Again, make a long story really short, after I was put under house arrest, it was a whole ordeal, but after 2 or 3 weeks, things kind of calmed down a little bit. We were allowed to go back out of our house, and I needed to get away. So I went down to this little vacation spot, city about 3 hours south, and I checked into this international hotel. Now, y'all, I was more exhausted than I think I've ever been in my life. I just felt like I'd been through the ringer for 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, emotionally as thin, I could not, I was just one foot in front of the other. I check into the hotel, and at those hotels over there, you have to give them your passport. So I slide the passport across the desk, and this very, very attractive hotel attendant reaches her hand out to take the passport, except she doesn't grab the passport, she grabs my hand, and she just grabs it, and she said, "Is there anything else that you want me to hold tonight?" I look back at her, it's very obvious what she means, and I'm just telling you, everything in me is like, this is what I want. This is what I need, this is what I deserve. And then it was almost like a split second, and probably because a lot of people were praying for me, all of a sudden the Holy Spirit opened my eyes so that I recognized that what was coming at me in the form of this beautiful young lady was the exact same spirit that was in that recording that was trying to murder my friends. Same destination, different means of getting there. You need to understand that if Satan attacks you, it's going to feel beautiful. That's where the movies all get it wrong. It's not scary. When Satan is in your presence, you don't feel afraid, you feel drawn. It feels like an angel of light saying, this is what you're waiting for. Satan's intention for you is death. Number 3, the longer sin grows, the harder it becomes to kill. That's what James is telling you. Sin starts as a desire. That desire then turns into an action. That action turns into a habit. That habit turns into an addiction. That addiction turns into a life trajectory. And the farther you go down that road, the harder the pattern is to break. You got to kill sin while it's young. You may think that wayward desire, that fantasy, you think it's not harming you as long as you keep it under control, as long as you indulge it only occasionally when there's no real consequence. But see, understand this, whether anybody is around to see it or not, it affects you. Its roots are spreading throughout your soul in a way that makes it increasingly difficult for you to eradicate. Right now, I'm reading a book with my 13-year-old son called Thoughts for Young Men by J.C. Ryle. J.C. Ryle was a British pastor in the 1800s, and Pastor Ryle says, listen to this, habits like trees are strengthened by age. A boy can bend an oak when it's a sapling, but 100 men could not root it up when it's a full-grown tree. Take sin seriously and kill it at the desire stage, because if you don't, it's gonna grow to the point that it takes you over. It forms habits in you, the ways, for example, that you relate to or think about the opposite sex. That doesn't happen in a moment. That's cultivated over a lifetime. What you do when you're upset or you're angry, how you see people who are in competition with you. Those desires grow and grow until they become you, until you cannot escape them. It's like another British Puritan, John Owen, says, you gotta be killing sin or it will be killing you. One of those two things is happening in you right now. Either you're actively killing sin or it is killing you. So arrest your thoughts. Stop watching the movie. Get out of the house. Call others and confess your sin. Our G4 ministries here have excellent resources for helping you deal with these sinful desires and addictions. And some of you should take advantage of them. Sometimes what you need most in a time of trial and temptation, what you need is community. Many of you have sin in your life that you're just playing with. It doesn't seem that bad to you. It's just a little bit of lust, a little bit of laziness, a little bit of gossip, a little bit of judgmentalism, self-righteousness, bitterness, hatred, racism, but it feels contained. It's harmless. It's just in your head. It's just in your head, and you filter it. But I'm telling you, it will not stay that way. Desire grows until it takes over your heart, at which point you couldn't contain it if you wanted to. It's like every once in a while we see some story on the news. Florida man gets mauled by a pet cougar. I don't know what it is about those people in Florida, but them and their animals. And I'm a sucker for that clickbait. I'm telling you, every time I'm like, ooh, I gotta read that. And so I click on it. And you read the story, right? You've read these stories, they're all the same. You find out that this guy in Florida had a pet cougar named Fluffy. And Fluffy snapped one day and bit his arm off. And then the thing that always gets me about these articles is they interview people in the neighborhood and everybody always acts so surprised. Oh, but Fluffy was always so gentle and so sweet. Fluffy is a predator. That's what I want to tell them. Always was a predator, always will be a predator. That's Fluffy's nature. If you keep a pet cougar in your house, at some point it's gonna bite your arm off. Sin is a predator. It will destroy you. And see, that leads me to number 4, which is very, very important. Satan is in the desire cultivation business. Your enemy's main tactic, hear this, is not to directly attack you. Sometimes he's just quietly and subtly cultivating sinful desires in you. Satan's in his interest not to show himself to you. He doesn't even like to be really over the top. What he does is he cultivates sinful desires and reinforces them until they become second nature to you, and you cannot escape them because they are deeply ingrained in your soul. I learned something recently about how ranchers cultivate beef cows. I'm a big beef fan, so any article I see about that, boom, I'm on it. All right, so I'm like, oh, I gotta read this. This is awesome. They found that high stress levels in cows make them release hormones that significantly downgrade the quality of the meat. That means if you go to a nice steakhouse, you are being served the remains of a very relaxed cow who lived a totally stress-free life. But if you order the T-bone from Waffle House, you're looking at a cow that was a nervous wreck, okay? I mean, it bit his fingernails all day long or whatever, all right? So, this article explained, modern ranchers do all they can to keep cows calm. Unlike what you've seen in movies, workers aren't yelling at them, cowboys aren't out chasing them, rounding them up with dogs. They never, ever, ever use cattle prods anymore. Because they found that if you'll just keep cows contented and comfortable, they'll go wherever they're led. And you can lead them fattened up, happy, satisfied, and stress-free straight to the slaughterhouse. Here's what Russ Moore says. Sometimes the Bible uses the language of predator and prey to describe the relationship between tempter and tempted. But often the scripture speaks of temptation in the language of rancher and livestock. You are not just being tracked down, you're being cultivated and groomed. So here's the question. Where is Satan cultivating you right now? Where are you being groomed? Is it through materialism? You find yourself taking more delight in things than people. You find yourself worried about it all the time. You're watching your generosity just trend downward. Maybe it's happening through lust, pornography, mental fantasies, flirtatious relationships. You indulge in books or movies that allow you to experience sexual pleasures vicariously, that let desires grow and grow until they become oak trees of mental habit in you. Maybe you're being cultivated through bitterness and anger and gossip. You find yourself thinking mean and hateful thoughts about people a lot. Or that what you enjoy most talking about, your favorite thing to talk about with your spouse or your daughter or your friends, your favorite subject is other people and what's wrong with them. You love talking about what's wrong with who, and I can't believe so-and-so did this. You ever thought about the fact that you can gossip with your spouse? You can gossip with your daughter? A lot of mothers seem to cultivate gossip in their daughters in the name of building relationship. Or fathers with their sons. Well, tell me what's wrong with all your friends. You want to have good communication, yes, but don't cultivate gossip. That's not going to end well for her. Gossip is gossip no matter who you're saying it to. Do you even know how to identify gossip? Maybe it's rage. When you're by yourself, do you cuss and hit stuff? You're like, yeah, but I'm not bothering anybody. Yeah, but that desire is growing and growing, and it will find an expression. How about alcoholism? Maybe alcohol has become the thing that takes the edge off of every day. It's the only way that you can deal with the stress of life. And maybe it's not quite alcoholism yet, but if you're honest, it's headed there, which is why you hide it from your spouse. So you don't want them to know quite how much it is because you're afraid that they're gonna be like, should you be doing that? You don't wanna hear that. Be killing sin or it will be killing you. You gotta attack it in the desire stage. You gotta do serious work in confessing it. One thing I'll share with you really quickly, just very practical. I got it from John Mark Comer when he was here last year, a couple years ago actually. It's called counter talking. I use Evernote on my phone. It's just a notes app. And what I've tried to do is actually verbalize the form that the desire or the lie takes in my mind. I've written it out, the exact form it takes in my mind, and then I've written out scriptures to counteract the lie that I've memorized. And so I go through these once a week or so. I've got about a dozen of them for the different temptations, the main temptations that I have. For example, I've got one right here, pulled up right here called the pursuit of riches. Basically, the way the lie comes out in my head and my heart is this way. An abundance of money is the good life. So don't give it away. Or if you do give it away, give only enough so that you can feel good about it, brag to the church about it, and look good before others, but do not give in a way that threatens a future of material comfort. That's the way the desire is formed in my mind. So the verse I used to counteract that, Matthew 6:19, lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust do corrupt, but lay up treasures in heaven. Here's another one, anger toward others. Anger toward others. Here's the way the lie comes out of my heart. You've got a right to be angry and to despise or look down on so-and-so. Because they're so dumb, they're so wrong, they're so mean. The verse that counteracts that desire, that lie, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, because you know what that means? It means that there's nothing that anyone will ever do against me that even compares to the way that I've wronged and sinned against God. I've got those cards for sexual temptation, for doubt, for everything else that I struggle with. Whether you use that or not, here's my point. You gotta take sin seriously. And you gotta do serious radical work in confessing it. You gotta get rid of it. You gotta find somebody today and make yourself accountable to them. Some of you are trying to fight a raging forest fire by throwing little cups of water at it, coming to church once a week and listening to some Christian songs. You have got to get the gospel deep in your heart. And James is saying, you better wake up and take it seriously. Let's return one more time to James's theme, verse 12. Blessed is the man, he says, who remains steadfast under trial, because when he has stood the test of time, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Be steadfast. James uses battle, and he uses athletic imagery to make this point. I've read a number of Navy SEAL books, not because I'm thinking of becoming one day. At 35 years old now, sadly, that ship has sailed for me, but I'm always fascinated by the stories of Hell Week. To become a SEAL, you know this, you gotta make it through 6-month training course, this intense 6-month BUD/S training course. And the hardest week of the 6 months is the third week, which they call Hell Week, 5.5 days in which you get almost no sleep. In 5.5 days, you'll run more than 200 miles. For up to 8 miles at a time, you will have a team of 6 soldiers that are all having to carry their boat over their head for 8 miles as they hike together through mud and slog and go uphill. You often do this wet and cold and covered inside and out of your clothes with sand because they make you roll around the beach before you do it. I was reading the account of one SEAL who said that because his team came in last 2 times in a row, they had to do cycles of 5 pull-ups, 10 push-ups, and 15 air squats for 6 hours straight. Sometimes at night when the temperature drops down to the low 40s, they stand neck deep in the cold ocean for over an hour. Now here's the thing, you know this, at any point, one of those men, one of those people can choose to quit by simply walking up to a bell and ringing that bell, at which point you are treated to hot coffee and warm donuts and a nice bed. And those sergeants are out there with the donuts and the coffee just all the time calling you, come on, give up, give up. But for those who remain steadfast at the end, they have the great honor of becoming a SEAL. Now, I realize that not many of you are gonna become SEALs. But James uses imagery like this to urge you to press on, stay steadfast. He says, stay steadfast, even under trial. Keep running that race. Don't ring that bell. Don't ring that bell because God has something amazing for you at the end. Remember that journal I read to you last week? It's like you can see it. You can see it through the mud. Through the mud, there's the sun. God is waiting for you at the finish line, and what you're gonna be there is stronger and more beautiful and more full of joy and more full of God than you could ever imagine. The point is this, hold on and don't give up. Suffering is not forever. God is up to something good. You say, but Pastor, there's a reason I'm not a Navy SEAL. I don't have that type of stuff in me. This is the best news of all. The reason you and I can be steadfast with him is because he is steadfast with us. Because God demonstrated his love for me, and that while I was still a sinner and an enemy, it was then Christ died for me. And then of his own will, he brought me forth by the word of truth. I wasn't looking for him. He came looking for me. I was running away from him. He chased after me, that I should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And then that means that if God didn't choose me because of my righteousness, he's not gonna forsake me because of my unrighteousness. He's the Father of lights in whom there's no shadow of turning. Now I'm convinced that the one who began that good work in me will complete it to the day of Jesus Christ. And that means I can remain steadfast to him because I know he's steadfast with me. And when I feel like I can't hang on to him, I just remember that he's never let go of me and never will let go of me. And the fact that he keeps hanging on to me keeps me hanging on to him. And when I fail him, he stays faithful to me, and I can get up and keep going after him because the Lord has promised good to me. His word, my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. The steadfastness of Jesus to you can produce in you steadfastness toward him. Can you anchor your life in that promise? It's the only sure foundation in the universe, which brings us to the way we're going to end our time in the Word day is communion. The bread and the cup, you should have got it. These are the symbols of God's steadfast commitment to us, and we're going to end our time by taking a few minutes just to sit with them. You should have gotten one of these when you came in. Take them out if you will. If you're not from church, this is the most confusing little contraption you will ever hold in your hands. Communion technology. New and improved, bread doesn't open from the top anymore. The bread is on the bottom. So when you open it, don't let it fall on the floor. See, you gotta catch it, okay? Take the bread. And this means, and it symbolizes a lot of different things, but today, here's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about what it means about God's steadfast promise to you. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. When Jesus held out that bread to them, he said, no matter what it is, I will never leave you. I don't care how much you fail. I don't care how embarrassed you are. I don't care how humiliated you have been. I will never leave you. He offers it to believers. If you're not a believer, this is not for you. It's like wearing a wedding ring. It's his promise. You can actually receive the Jesus represented by this bread. But don't take it because it's not for you. But for the believer, it's a promise. I will never, never leave you. Take it and remember him. The cup. This cup, he said, is the new covenant. You know what the word covenant means? Promise. And the thing about that promise, y'all, is it was one-sided. He didn't say if you obey and you do well enough, my blood will cover you. He gave you a one-sided covenant. I'll be your righteousness. I'll be your forgiveness. I'll be everything. Just receive it. This cup reminds us that God doesn't hold us because of our performance. He holds us freely because of a gift. It's a one-sided covenant. Jesus said, as often as you do this, I want you to remember. At all of our campuses, would you stand to your feet? Could you join your hearts, your voices, and let's sing, let's glorify the Lord for his steadfast, never giving up commitment to us.